In this video, we are exploring 3 different pouring methods on the same coffee. Welcome, my name is Patrick Rolfe and this is Coffee with April. For this episode, we're going to celebrate the fact that our plastic April brewers are starting to arrive around the world. Big thank you to all of you that pre-orders, and now it's basically open for anyone to receive theirs. Now, what we want to do is walk you through 3 different basically pouring structures for the brewer. As some of you know that's been following us for some time, we make a big difference between what we call circle pour and center pour. So what we want to do in this video is just basically brew 3 different coffees, same grind size, same coffee. And we want to do that with 3 different pouring techniques just to show you and talk about the difference in taste. So basically, how can you manipulate your cup of coffee with just changing your pouring? Now, the coffee that we're using is a washed processed Kenyan coffee from the Kainamui factory. It's an AA selection. We're dosing 12 grams of coffee. This is ground on the ditting behind me to a micron of 737-ish. And the water that we're using sits at 92 degrees Celsius. Now, pouring is obviously gonna change how the water flows through the coffee. That's the most important thing. So what we're discussing is basically uniformity in terms of extraction. And that's really one of the more important things when it comes to brewing, right? And that's something that's gonna dictate both how long the brew time will be, but also then how evenly all of that coffee is being saturated at different parts of the brew. So each pour here is a standard classic 100-gram pour. And then we let the coffee sit for 40 seconds. And then we move on to the second pour. And the first cup here is basically a circle pour all the way through the brew. Next cup is a center pour all the way through the brew. And then the last cup is the kind of finished version of what we're doing at the moment, which is basically at the moment a 50-50 circle and center pour. And one of the things we can see directly when we're actually brewing is that depending on if we go circle or center, you're gonna have the coffee very differently in terms of saturation. So I can, for example, see on the center pour that a lot of the coffee beds were still dry, moving or finishing the first pour, whereas in, for example, the circle pours, everything has been wet quite uniformly, very evenly. Now, this naturally impacts what is the size of the brewer, what is the shape of the brewer. We have flatbed brewers here. One can argue that when you're working with a cone brewer, you might want to pour a little bit differently because how different the coffee bed actually is saturated. We also don't like to do any extra stirring or any extra shaking or tapping on the filters. We simply just pour the water and kind of let that go through. But part of what we realized early on with these brewers that depending on if you do a circle versus a center pour or a mix, you're going to be able to dictate and plan the outcome of your brew in terms of brew time a lot more efficient than if you were to not mix it. So basically what we have here is that the center pour is already done, and that's at 2 minutes and 30 seconds. So that actually had the fastest drawdown both in the first pour, but also now then clearly in the second pour. And the 2 other brews are definitely taking a lot more time, right? So that's a really interesting way to look at it at the moment. And then you kind of have to wonder, okay, it's the same grind size, it's the same coffee, but we still have a much, much faster brew time. So the question here is, can we assume that the water has gone through the coffee as uniformly as in the other ones, or is it going a lot faster simply because we have a little bit of channeling in the brew? That's kind of an interesting observation. Second brew to be done is actually the circle and the center pour, and that clocks out at 250. So this is our current kind of way of brewing. and the circle pour is still brewing, and that clocks out at 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So as you can see, with the same grind size, we have a very, very wide range of basically different total brew times, right? And what we're gonna do now is that we're gonna blind taste all of these. We're gonna do some measurements in terms of strength, and then we're gonna get right back to you with some feedback and with some ideas about how this actually turns out in terms of cup quality. So we're back after evaluating these 3 cups, and there's some really interesting insights to share here. First of all, just visually throughout the whole brew, but also now in the end of the brew, we can see that there is a different level of coffee grounds in each filter, right? So the circle pour is the one that goes up the highest because it has the slowest flow rate, right? And then the center pour is the one that has the thinner kind of coffee bed where the coffee hasn't risen that much, and the reason for that is because the water went through way faster. Also makes a lot of sense. And then the last pour, which is circle and center, ends up somewhere in the middle. So that makes sense, and it's something that we can bring with us to the next step, which was TDS measuring, right? And here is where it becomes kind of interesting. And think about it again, we had the same dose, we had the same grind size, we had the same amount of water, we had the same brewer, same coffee, we just changed how we're pouring the water. So first cup here, circle pour, has the highest TDS or strength, 1.37. The center pour has the lowest TDS, 1.17, when the last cup, the circle and center pour, has a TDS of 1.35. So quite close to the circle pour. Let's discuss the 2 cups first, the circle and the center pour. Now, this makes a lot of sense. We could see in the initial pour of the center that what happens is that we had a lot of dry beds just basically rising up from the coffee bed. And this is a little bit of an indication of channeling. Channeling is a big thing to consider when you do a center pour on any kind of brewer, really. And that's also what is reflecting both on the taste, but also here on the final strength, right? So we have a much, much lower strength in this cup than the circle pour. Now the circle pour here, both the level of the coffee grounds after we brewed, but also the TDS, indicates then a much longer contact time. In terms of taste, this becomes a little muddier. It becomes sweet, well balanced, some people might say, but tactility is not very clean. We simply think the strength is a little bit too high, together with a contact time that also been a bit too long, which is really not allowing us to showcase the cleanliness of this coffee, which is something that we really appreciate. Meaning that we actually don't prefer this cup over, for example, the center pour. So the center pour here is much lower strength, closer to where, for example, we would be cupping. But what happens here then, because of the channeling, is that we have a little bit of sourness in the cup. We have a really kind of light, juicy body, which we appreciate taste-wise, but the constellations of flavors and taste balance doesn't really make sense, especially when we go into the lower temperatures. That's when this coffee really starts to become a little bit unbalanced, a little bit sour in this case, right? So basically a full center pour here is not benefiting the coffee, right? It makes the body interesting, but the flavor composition, it doesn't make much sense, and the acidity gets out of control. Now, when we're looking at the circle and the center pour, we have a TDS closer to only the circle pour, but the taste notes are much, much different. So what we have here is kind of the best of the 2 previous cups. So we have a balance, we have a sweetness, we have a lightness in the character, and we have a juiciness to the cup as well, which actually will really work. So for us, the circle center pour tastes much better. That's also why we're doing this in the first place, right? Then in terms of target TDS, we would agree on the fact that 1.35 is also for us on the higher end. We usually push our cups down to at least 1.3, if not slightly below. So we do believe that it could benefit from just a slightly coarser grind size. However, in our experience, if there's a coffee that is suitable taste-wise to perform better at a slightly higher TDS, again around 1.35, Kenyan coffees would be the way to go. Now, this was basically just a quick summary of explaining why are we pouring the way we do, and what does the impact on these different pouring structure has on the same grind size, the same coffee, the same brew method, right? Naturally, there's a lot more to explore, and we would love to hear your thoughts and considerations about this as well. Do you have a style of pouring that you think works better for certain coffees, for certain brewers? Naturally, we'll take this conversation over to Patreon and have a little bit more of an in-depth talk about what's going on and why we prefer doing certain things in terms of recipes. We love to hear from all of you that already received the plastic brewer. What's your thoughts? What's your opinions? And with that, we want to, as always, thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. Have a good day. We want to give a special thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. It's because of you that we are able to continue to make these videos. And we want you all to feel free to always come with suggestions and ideas on the content that you want to see, because we are doing this for you and because of you. Thank you from all of us here at April.